Chapter 1. The Silent Struggle of a Widow. The cabin stood at the very edge of the valley, where the land sloped downward into wilderness and the road simply vanished, as if the world itself had decided not to go any farther. Tall pine trees ringed the small wooden structure, their dark trunks rising like solemn sentinels. When the wind passed through their branches, it carried a low, whispering sound, soft, constant, and lonely. It was the kind of place most people passed without noticing, if they passed it at all. The widow lived there alone. Once, the cabin had been full of life. Footsteps had echoed across its wooden floor. Laughter had spilled through its doorway on warm evenings. A man's voice had greeted the dawn, steady and reassuring. But that life had ended beneath a gray sky, when the earth closed over her husband's grave and the world continued forward without waiting for her to catch up. Since that day, silence had become her closest companion. She did not choose it. It simply arrived, quietly, the way grief often does. At first, it filled the spaces her husband had once occupied. Then it settled into her thoughts, her routines, her breath. She learned to move without sound, to speak only when necessary, and to keep her pain folded neatly inside where no one could see it. Her body had grown weaker with time. Illness crept through her slowly, unnoticed at first. It began as stiffness in the morning, aches that lingered longer than they should have. She blamed age, exhaustion, sorrow, anything that felt easier to accept. But the pain deepened, settling into her bones, stealing her strength piece by piece. Some days, even standing felt like a victory. Other days, breathing itself was an effort. Still, she rose each morning. She sat on the edge of her bed, letting her feet rest against the cold floor while she gathered the resolve to move. The cabin was small and worn. One room, a narrow bed, a wooden table her husband had built with his own hands. A single window faced the valley, framing a view she once loved and now barely recognized. The walls creaked with age, and the roof leaked when the rain fell hard enough. But it was home, the last physical proof that her life had once been shared. That morning, the wind was relentless. It rattled the cabin door with sudden force, making the hinges groan. The sound cut through the stillness, sharp and alarming. She froze, her hand tightening around the mug she held. The door shook again, harder this time, as though the wind itself were testing its limits. She already knew what was wrong. The door had been damaged for weeks. The lock no longer sat properly in its frame. A split ran along the bottom of the wood, widening with each passing day. At night, cold air slipped through the gaps, brushing her skin like unseen fingers. More than once, she had lain awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the door creak and wondering what would happen when it finally gave way. The broken door was more than an inconvenience. It was a reminder of how exposed she had become. Once, her husband would have fixed it without hesitation. He would have laughed at the wind, called it stubborn, and gone to work with his tools while she watched from the doorway. He had always believed that problems existed to be solved, not feared. His confidence had wrapped around her like armor. Now, that armor was gone. She gathered the tools she still owned, an old hammer, a handful of nails bent from previous attempts, and a narrow plank of wood she had saved for reasons she could no longer remember. Her hands trembled as she carried them outside. The air was cold, sharp against her skin, carrying the scent of pine and dry earth. With aching hands, she began to work. She leaned the plank against the damaged frame, trying to position it just right. When she raised the hammer, her arm felt heavier than it should have. The first strike missed the nail completely, sending a jolt of pain up her wrist. She sucked in a sharp breath and steadied herself, pressing her back against the door. Each movement demanded more effort than the last. The sound of hammer against wood echoed across the valley, loud and exposed. She was suddenly aware of how visible she was, standing alone in the open, her weakness on display. The thought unsettled her, but she pushed it aside. Fear had no place here, not if she wanted to survive. She tried again. The nail sank into the wood, slowly, reluctantly. Her breathing grew shallow, her chest tightening with strain. She paused often, resting her forehead against the door, waiting for the dizziness to pass. The temptation to stop, to sit down and let the wind have its way, pressed heavily on her. But stopping was not an option. Pride kept her silent. Fear kept her moving. She did not ask for help because she no longer believed in it. After her husband's death, she had gone into town once, her heart heavy with cautious hope. She had spoken to neighbors she barely knew, to men who claimed to be busy, to women who offered sympathy without commitment. Promises were made. None were kept. That day, she learned a quiet truth. Grief made people uncomfortable. And discomfort made them turn away. So she returned to her cabin and stopped asking. Her hands blistered as she worked. One nail bent under a poorly aimed strike, forcing her to pull it free. As she did, the sharp edge caught her thumb, opening a small cut. Blood welled up quickly, bright against her pale skin. She stared at it for a moment, then wiped it away on her sleeve and continued. Pain had become familiar. Endurance was her language now. There was dignity in her struggle, though no one was there to witness it. Not the kind of dignity that demanded recognition, but the kind that existed quietly, stubbornly, refusing to disappear. Every strike of the hammer was an act of defiance against a world that seemed determined to forget her. She thought of her husband then, of his voice, his laughter, the way he used to tell her she was stronger than she knew. At the time, she had dismissed the idea. Strength had always belonged to him, or so she believed. Now, standing alone in the cold, she understood what he had meant. Strength did not always look like confidence or power. Sometimes, it looked like standing upright when your body begged you to fall. Sometimes, it was simply continuing when no one was watching. The wind shifted suddenly, slamming the door inward with force. She stumbled back, catching herself just in time. Her heart raced, fear flashing sharp and bright through her exhaustion. If the door broke completely, she knew she would not be able to fix it again. Not today, perhaps not ever. Her hands shook harder as she lifted the hammer once more. An unspoken battle raged within her, between weakness and will. Her body cried out for rest, but her spirit refused to surrender. This time, she worked slowly, carefully, focusing on each small movement. She drove the nail in inch by inch, breathing through the pain. When it finally held, she released a shaky breath she had not realized she was holding. The repair was imperfect. The door still leaned slightly, and gaps remained. But it was stronger than before. For now, it would hold. She stepped back, exhaustion washing over her like a heavy tide. The valley remained silent. No voice praised her effort. No hand reached out in support. Only the trees stood witness, unmoved yet present. She gathered her tools and returned inside, closing the door gently behind her. It creaked, but it stayed shut. Leaning against it, she closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of rest. Outside, the wind continued its endless journey through the valley. Inside, a widow stood alone, ill, tired, and forgotten, but still standing. And somewhere beyond the trees, unseen and unheard, the story had already begun to move toward its next turning point. Chapter 2. The Pride of a Lawman. The sound reached the valley before the man did. Hooves struck the hard earth with steady insistence, each step echoing through the narrow trail like a warning. Dust lifted into the air, drifting slowly between the trees. In a place where silence usually ruled, the noise felt unnatural, as though the land itself were being challenged. The lawman rode with confidence born of habit. He sat tall in the saddle, shoulders squared, his back straight despite the long hours he had already spent riding. The badge on his chest caught the light whenever the sun broke through the trees, glinting sharply. He wore it openly, deliberately, the way a man wears something he wants the world to notice. It was not just a symbol of duty, it was a reminder of power. He had patrolled this region for years, long enough to believe he understood it completely. To him, isolated places were rarely innocent. People who lived far from towns were often hiding, from the law, from their pasts, or from responsibilities they refused to face. He had learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts told him that the cabin ahead deserved scrutiny. As he approached the clearing, he slowed his horse and took in the scene. The cabin was small and worn, its wood darkened by weather and age. The door looked damaged, crudely reinforced with a plank that did not quite fit. Standing near it was a woman, thin, pale, her posture stiff with exhaustion. She looked out of place and yet entirely rooted there, like something the land itself had shaped. He did not greet her. Instead, he watched her from the saddle, allowing the moment to stretch. Silence had a way of unsettling people, and he knew how to use it. When she did not look away, his eyes narrowed slightly. Most people lowered their gaze. Seeing her alone, struggling with the door, he felt no urge to help. Only suspicion. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice firm and uninviting. The question was not a courtesy. It was an assertion. She turned toward him fully, her expression calm but guarded. "I was fixing my door," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost flat. That alone irritated him. "By yourself?" he asked. She nodded once. He let out a short, dismissive breath. "That's not very smart." He expected something then, a defensive reply, perhaps, or a flicker of embarrassment. Instead, she stood still, her hands resting at her sides. The lack of reaction unsettled him. Silence, in his experience, usually meant fear. But this felt different. He swung his leg over the saddle and dismounted, boots crunching against the gravel. The horse shifted behind him, snorting softly. He adjusted his belt, ensuring his weapon was clearly visible. Authority, he believed, should never be subtle. "You live out here alone?" he asked, moving closer. "Yes. No family. No one looking after you." She shook her head. Each answer was clipped, precise. She offered no explanations, no apologies. To him, it felt like resistance disguised as obedience. He circled slightly, his gaze scanning the cabin, the tools near the door, the worn path leading into the trees. "People don't usually live this far out unless they're avoiding something," he said. "You hiding from anyone?" She met his eyes then, really met them. There was no fear in her gaze. Only weariness and something else he could not quite place. "No," she said. Her calm response irritated him more than anger would have. He began asking sharper questions: how long she had lived there, where she got her supplies, whether anyone ever visited, if she had papers proving the land was hers. His tone grew colder, more authoritative, as though he were interrogating a suspect rather than speaking to a widow. She answered only when necessary. Often, she said nothing at all. Her silence weighed on him. He was used to people filling space with words, trying to justify themselves, to explain away whatever he suspected. But she did not play that role. She listened. She waited. He mistook restraint for submission. To him, silence meant she understood who held power. He glanced again at the door. "You should have someone fix that properly," he said, his voice edged with condescension. "This isn't a safe place for a woman to live alone." The words were meant to remind her of her vulnerability. She did not flinch. That unsettled him deeply. He took a step back, suddenly aware that the encounter was not unfolding as he expected. He felt the need to reassert himself, to end the conversation on his terms. "Be careful," he said finally. "Out here, trouble comes quickly. Especially for people without protection." The implication was clear. He turned away, mounting his horse again. As he rode off, dust rose behind him, swallowing the clearing. He did not look back. In his mind, the encounter was finished. But as the sound of hooves faded, the woman remained standing by her door, watching him disappear into the trees. Only then did she allow herself to exhale. The tension drained from her body, leaving her trembling with exhaustion. Inside her, something shifted. She had endured his scrutiny, his suspicion, his unearned authority. She had done so silently, without bowing, without pleading. The lawman rode away believing he had established dominance. He had not. He had merely revealed his pride. And pride, when left unchecked, had a way of calling fate's attention. The valley returned to stillness. The wind stirred the trees. The cabin stood firm. And far down the trail, the lawman rode on, unaware that his certainty would soon be tested, not by force, but by the consequences of his own arrogance. The story was no longer moving quietly. It was waiting. Chapter 3. The shocking ending. The storm arrived without warning. By nightfall, the sky had turned the color of old iron, heavy and bruised. Wind tore through the valley with sudden fury, bending the pines until they groaned in protest. Rain followed, sharp and relentless, drumming against the cabin roof like an approaching army. Inside, the widow sat near the stove, wrapped in her shawl, listening to the world test the fragile borders of her shelter once again. The door shuddered. She rose slowly, every joint protesting, and placed her hand against the wood. It held, barely. The plank she had nailed that morning strained under the pressure, but it did not give way. She closed her eyes, whispering a quiet prayer she had not spoken in years. Far down the trail, the lawman rode hard against the storm. He had intended to reach the town before dark, but pride had pushed him forward when caution should have slowed him down. He knew these paths, told himself he had traveled them 100 times. The storm, however, cared nothing for his confidence. The ground turned slick beneath his horse's hooves. Wind lashed at his coat, and rain blurred his vision. Then the horse stumbled. The fall was sudden and violent. The lawman hit the ground hard, the breath driven from his lungs. Pain shot through his leg as he tried to rise and failed. The horse bolted into the darkness, leaving him alone, injured, soaked, and helpless. For the first time in years, authority meant nothing. He shouted, but the wind tore his voice apart. He reached for his badge out of habit, as if it could save him. It could not. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time lost meaning as cold crept into his bones. At dawn, the storm broke. The widow stepped outside cautiously, surveying the damage. Fallen branches littered the ground. The valley looked wounded but calm. As she followed the trail to check for debris, she saw him. The lawman lay near the path, pale and barely conscious. She stopped. This was the man who had judged her, doubted her, dismissed her strength. For a long moment, she simply stood there, the weight of choice settling heavily on her shoulders. No one would know if she turned away. The world had taught her that lesson well. But she did not turn away. With effort that cost her dearly, she helped him back to the cabin. She tended his injury with shaking hands, fed the fire, and gave him water. He drifted in and out of sleep, confusion etched across his face. When he finally woke fully, he looked at her, not from a horse, not from above, but from the floor, powerless. "You saved me," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied. Shame flickered in his eyes. "I was wrong about you." She met his gaze steadily. "I know." Days later, when word reached town of what had happened, the story spread quickly. The lawman resigned soon after, his certainty forever shaken. Help finally came to the cabin, not out of pity, but respect. The widow returned to her quiet life, unchanged in the ways that mattered most. Strength had never announced itself. It had simply endured.